Thanks to all of you for being here. Just to sort of emphasize the problem that we're dealing with Ukraine, between Russia and the European Union, there's probably bound to be lots of trouble when President Yanukovych decided not to sign the association agreement with the European Union in 2013 and instead opted for closer ties with Russia. Some of you, I don't know if you've seen this on Netflix or if you were watching all of the Oscars ceremony for this year, but amongst the nominees for documentaries was this film called Winter on Fire, Ukraine's Fight for Freedom. And this film really emphasizes this idea of Ukrainians up against the police, like this innocent young woman right here, or girl, fighting the police through nonviolent resistance, and the police attacked and brutally tried to suppress this movement, this protest movement, this revolution, but ultimately failed. And in fact, there was a premiere of this movie in Ukraine where the U.S. ambassador used the moment to emphasize that this will show the world Ukraine's struggle for freedom every day as it fights Russian aggression, as it fights its own problems at home. And a lot of accounts do talk about this moral struggle. And as you'll see, I kind of got into it as well and sort of got dragged into this. And they haven't really looked at the difficult moments in this revolution that are frankly uncomfortable to talk about. Namely that violence, as I'm going to try and argue in this book that I'm writing, it played a central role in this. It played a central role in these events, and probably that led to the overthrow of the Yanukovych regime ultimately, and then this provoked further violence. That's why I call this Pandora's box, because in some ways, both the revolutionaries, but also those in government, were playing with a box, which could be called violence, all right? And they didn't really want to, they knew that this is bad, and they're not going to talk about it publicly, but ultimately they both open it. And the regime and the revolutionaries make use of violence in ways that, like Pandora's box, brings disease, misery, and death. And while Pandora's box ends with hope flying out of the box in the Greek myth, well, I'm not sure about hope yet. It's very difficult to see it. Again, this emphasis on people power. It is very important in understanding the Euromaidan protests, and some observers would talk about this metaphysical moment for Ukraine where there's this choice between good and evil, where there is the police and their abuse, or proizvol in Russian, and the people united across regions, across gender divisions, across age divisions, across the political spectrum. But in fact, it really wasn't that simple. Yes, I was sort of drawn into a metaphysical moment of sorts. I felt like I needed to be at the Maidan and see what was going on there. And I did go there to the Kyiv Maidan for a week in December. And then I went actually to the east, to the Donbass region, to Donetsk in January. I went to the cities of Donetsk and Kharkiv and stayed with a family in Donetsk, near the Donetsk airport, for about 10 days. This could have been a peaceful revolution. There was an Orange Revolution that involved hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating against rigged elections that favored Viktor Yanukovych, who was to be the successor of Leonid Kuchma. They result in victory. This forged election is overturned. But still, there were problems with this country through the 90s and the 2000s. It was a very divided country, you could say, in terms of electoral preferences, where these regions in orange, various shades of orange, voted for Viktor Yushchenko, the preferred candidate of the opposition in Ukraine then, and Viktor Yanukovych, the favorite of the authoritarian regime at the time. And he had gained all these southern and eastern regions, as well as Crimea. And this repeated in 2010, leading to Viktor Yanukovych winning by a very slight margin. And again, he was able to do that with the help of the East and the South and Crimea. And the opposition candidate, who was at odds with Yushchenko, but the least of all evils probably for the opposition, just barely lost. And actually, this leads to a regime that under Yanukovych will remove Yulia Tymoshenko as prime minister, put her in prison. They will rewrite the constitution under very shady circumstances, and suddenly the president has all these powers he never had before. Under this president, we see the city of Kyiv, the capital, lose its office of mayor, and instead an administrator directly appointed by the president will run the city. And then the city council, elections were canceled for city council. So basically, Yanukovych was denying something like Washington, D.C., or even something bigger, an even bigger city, its right to vote and to be represented in government. And in the meantime, this protest movement that had led to Yushchenko becoming president during the Orange Revolution, it had fought for a better political system, a more just political system where there'd be rule of law, where they'd fight corruption and an abusive police, an abusive prosecutor's office, and an abusive tax administration. All of that would end. But the fact is, none of that changed. None of that changed. It got worse under Yanukovych. Under Yanukovych, the economy started to stagnate. By 2013, it looked like there were negative growth rates. And in the meantime, 12 billionaires, including one of Yanukovych's sons, who was a dentist. Anyway, these historical divisions, they've been around for a while. As a historian, I was very much aware of that, and that's what sort of made me worried about what would happen in the East and in the South. And that's why I went to Donetsk, because it is in this part that really was not a part of Ukrainian history. The revolution of 1648, a major revolution in 1648 in Ukrainian history, did not involve these regions at all. Ukraine's war for independence between 1917 and 1920, it completely avoided the East and the South and Crimea again. But again, violence. One of the things that made me realize that to talk about this Euromaidan as a moral struggle, it's important to understand how violence turned both sides ugly. And we saw this actually already in May 2013. There were a number of protest movements in Ukraine up to this point against the Yanukovych regime. There was the tax Maidan, where small and mid-sized businesses protested tax policies that would ruin them. There was the language Maidan, which was against a law that was pushed through parliament that allowed Russian to be the official language in many of the country's regions, and thus sort of give the Russian language a privileged position against Ukrainian. And there were other protest movements as well, and the problem with these was gentlemen like him started to show up and beat up protesters. This guy, his name is Vadim Titushko. He was from the central Ukrainian city of Bila Tserkva, and the Party of Regions, which is Yanukovych's party, they had a youth wing called Young Regionals, and Young Regionals from Bila Tserkva, they showed up in Kyiv to beat up a rally called Rise Up Ukraine. And that was led by the opposition. And these guys, they just pummeled these protesters, and they also went after journalists. And Titushko wound up getting a 2-year jail sentence, a suspended jail sentence. And when he was asked why he was doing this, amidst his cursing, he said, "I'm not doing it for the money, I'm doing it for the ideas." Well, there are a lot of those like Titushko, and they even got a nickname for themselves, the Titushki. And Titushki in Russian and Ukrainian means a hired thug. And this is the problem. Hired thugs were fomenting violence at rallies, sometimes, well, most of the time, with the police collaborating with them. This policeman is doing practically nothing to stop this guy from doing a martial arts move on a journalist, a photojournalist. The police, on May the 18th, they literally stood in between the hired toughs and the protesters, and then they just let those guys go after the protesters. Another thing, though, that was also on my mind before the Euromaidan protests was an incident in the southern town of Radivka. It's a very small village in the Mykolaiv region in the south. A woman was brutally raped June the 27th, 2013, and almost murdered. She managed to hide from the police who did it. There were 3 policemen who attacked her. 2 of them assaulted her sexually. The village knew that these policemen had been very abusive, and in the Mykolaiv region, the prosecutor's office was notorious for corruption. The police were notorious for corruption and abuse. And this uprising started in Vradivka on July the 1st, involving something like over 1,000 people, and they stormed the police building. They threw Molotov cocktails at it. They attacked the building. They forced the policemen to hide in the basement. And then this protest movement spread throughout Ukraine against the police, against the prosecutor's office, because both institutions were seen as the main sources of corruption in Ukraine, that and the court system. And it really looked ugly, because I happened to go to Lviv in western Ukraine to see my landlady. I was in Poland doing archival research, and she mentioned this story, and she said, you know, these people did the right thing. They stood up for themselves. They did what was right. They fought back. They beat up those police, and they almost took that building down. And that kind of worried me. It was like, this might be coming to Ukraine soon. And actually, there were a number of spontaneous uprisings throughout Ukraine, but also in the south and east of the regions, the south and east of Ukraine. Well, we do get to the Maidan. It was relatively peaceful. And it was a response to this corrupt Yanukovych regime, but also it's because the Yanukovych regime refused to sign this association agreement with the European Union, which many protesters thought would lead to rule of law and the beginning of the end of corruption in Ukraine. A chance to travel to Europe as well. There were many people from the western part of Ukraine, some from the central part of Ukraine, who traveled to Poland and other countries west who belong to the European Union. And it was relatively peaceful. There were special forces called Berkut, and they did try and drive these protesters out on November the 25th. There were some disorders, probably fomented by these hired thugs, Titushki, but also by radicals near the Cabinet and Ministers building. And this is also the problem. With this protest movement, you had people who were interested in joining Europe, who were committed to it. But you also had elements from Ukraine's far right, the far right nationalists, and they'd been involved in a lot of these protests too. And some of them got very ugly, and some of them were joined by football ultras, football fans, soccer fans, who have been under the influence of xenophobia, sexism, homophobia, racism, the whole thing. And so there was that side too, to the Maidan. That side didn't really show itself until Berkut decided to attack the Maidan on November 30th, 2013. It was around 4 in the morning, and the leaders of the political opposition, and those political opposition leaders were Vitaly Klitschko, Arseny Yatsenyuk, and Oleg Tyagny-Bok, all leaders of political parties that were very weak and ineffective, somewhat weakened by the Yanukovych administration putting pressure on the businesses and oligarchs who supported these parties, but also these leaders of these political parties lacked the charisma and frankly lacked the political savviness really to unite Ukrainians. They had said, look, we're going to have another rally on December the 1st. It looked like this whole Maidan was going to end, but then people did stay around. They didn't want to leave. They didn't want to end the protest. And then the Berkut forces suddenly went in. They attacked it like they would a prison riot, and it was really brutal, and they went beyond the square, attacking anybody on their way they could run across. And this really inflamed people. There was the impression, although it's not true, that this first Euromaidan protest before it was broken up was led by students. But in fact, it was students, young professionals, also older people were there, and older people were amongst the victims of this Berkut violence. And it kind of unleashed things because the next day, well, actually, even the day before, November the 30th, the protesters fled to St. Michael's Monastery up on a hill above the Maidan, and they started to rally together at St. Michael's Square, but there was this problem. Police buses were going through and people were assaulting the police buses. People were assaulting any police wearing uniforms. And so there were civic groups, including one of my former graduate students whom I interviewed, who stopped these people from attacking these buses, let the buses of policemen go through, and they tried their best to sort of turn this movement in a nonviolent direction. The problem was December the 1st, things really got out of control. About 1 million people showed up and retook the Maidan. And it was a great emotional thing, an uplifting thing, but a journalist that I interviewed said it was scary to him to see all of these people coming to the Maidan, and this, he'd never seen it in his whole life in Kiev, to see all these people coming, because he knew a crowd could not be controlled. A crowd could not be controlled and something could happen, and it did. The presidential administration building on Bankovy Street was attacked by all of these guys. There were various versions of who did this. For instance, this grader bulldozer, how did it wind up on this narrow street in front of the president's house, president's office? Well, one of the people I interviewed said it just sort of wound up there and it was just by accident, and they just took the keys and they took the vehicle. But these radicals drove it through the street to the presidential administration building and threatened to storm the presidential administration building. One person I interviewed said there were a lot of these guys that had the symbol for the idea of the nation, which is what radical nationalists display. It looks like the Wolf's Angel cross in Nazi lore. Basically, that's the idea of the nation. So there were radical nationalists there, football fans who were unruly, who caused really a lot of mayhem. The police threw grenades, they threw tear gas, they chased the crowd away, politicians tried to intervene, entertainers tried to intervene, and ultimately, you know, a lot of people wound up in jail, a lot of people wound up badly beaten, and the police, they just ran everyone off that street, and they ran them down Institutsky Street back to the Maidan, which was below this street. And it was really awful. And it was at this time that when the new Maidan starts, that they start what is called Maidan self-defense. It was a very informal thing. When I was there in December, I hung out with some of these people, and they weren't officially divided up into what they called sotnias. Sotnias are hundreds or like battalions, and they had a total of 42 of them by the time the revolution was over, 42 of them. Some of these battalions were very, moderate. Some of them were liberal, but there were others who were far right. Some had neo-Nazi sympathies. And amongst these 42 sotnias was one run by Right Sector. And Right Sector was an umbrella organization for all these different far-right radical groups. And there were stories that hey, these were Russians who did this. Russians did it. And they said you could tell because the football chant that they yelled was the same that they yell in St. Petersburg. But it was probably radicals from Ukraine itself, probably from Kiev itself. Well, I did go to the Maidan, and again, there was a lot done to sort of defend this protest city with these Maidan self-defense hundreds. At the time I went, I spent a night on night guard where they watched out for any possible provocations. And there was one major provocation. The night of December 11th, December 10th, December 11th, there was an attempt by Berkut to force the people off the Maidan again. And these self-defense hundreds stood there, and kept the Berkut forces from driving them out. And the Berkut forces they went back to their bases. In the meantime, they built up these barricades that sort of look like the barricades you'd see in the French Revolution of 1848, really, really impressive. And I spent one night there. They didn't have official hundreds organized yet, battalions organized yet. They had basically groups from different parts of Ukraine that had tents at certain parts of the camp, and those people on those certain parts of the camp took care of their parts of the barricade, basically. They watched out for provocateurs, but for a while it was just dealing with drunkards. But there were always rumors of provocations. I picked up leaflets that talked about how to identify a provocateur. And a couple of times, my friend told me, you got to go to the Maidan, there's a provocation. They're going to try and stop a provocation. Nothing happened, though. But that was always in the air in late December. And in late December, it kind of looked like things were dying out. But what happened all of a sudden was on December the 25th, a journalist who'd been investigating financial abuses by Viktor Yanukovych, including his palatial estate called Mezhihiria. It's this very gaudy estate that looks Trump-like, or, yeah, probably Trump-like, not Louis XVI-like. That she was investigating that all the time, and she was warning people that the police would go after her. And actually, I was volunteering to translate her blog where she talked about, well, this is why they're going to go after me. And I translated it, and it was very ironic. That night that she got brutally beaten by these thugs, I was translating this thing, and a lot of the story didn't make sense. But then she got beat up, and everyone got outraged, really outraged. And this led to a march by a movement called Euromaidan. And Euromaidan consisted of drivers of cars and vans who sometimes they drove medical supplies, or later when the revolution got violent, they drove people to hospitals. But at this point, they drove to Mezhihiria, which is many miles from Kiev, and they marched on that palace, Mezhihiria, and threatened to do more. And some people wondered if maybe this was a sort of a provocation by the opposition, because later on, the journalist who was beaten up, Tatiana Chornovol, her assailants were never prosecuted. They were never prosecuted. The case just kind of like disappeared. And actually, one of the Euromaidan protesters who got killed on the Maidan thought that it was a provocation, and he and his friends thought that maybe there is some force trying to agitate people on the Maidan, trying to drive these protests in a certain direction, in a very bad direction. And in fact, this young man, he said at one point after Chornovol was beaten up, I just got to get out of this. You know, I got to think about the next 15 to 20 years of my life. This is crazy. Well, there was something else that drove people over the edge, and even me. The dictatorship laws that were thrust through Parliament by a hands-up vote, very questionable how it was done legally. these dictatorship laws basically made it illegal to protest in Ukraine. Illegal. And basically anybody that was on the Maidan could be subject to those laws. And I thought it was outrageous. I happened to be in Kiev that weekend to interview somebody. That interview didn't come about. But my friend that I did interview, he said, "You want to spread protest leaflets?" And I said, "All right, let's do it." We went through the metro station. We spread these leaflets that talked about what these laws were and what they would do to this country. We urged people to show up at the Maidan at noon. To show up at noon on Sunday, January the 19th. And I got to tell you, I mean, maybe I was having a metaphysical moment. I don't know, but I was. I had suddenly become the participant and less the observer, and everyone took my leaflets. And there was a metro cop that stopped us. He stopped us briefly, but nothing happened. But still, yes, I did. That's what I did. Well, what happened at that meeting? People were really angry because the political opposition leaders didn't do anything, and they got booed because they refused to take any action. The people on the Maidan were making demands like, you guys have to choose one leader out of you three, and that one leader is going to lead us against Yanukovych. And one of the guys speaking said, "But the leader is the people of Ukraine. We can't do this." And then he got booed. And it was really strange because I was there, and I wasn't sure why they were booing and whistling. I thought that maybe some titushki had come in from the back or something. And then they started to yell leadery, we want leaders. And then there was this guy that I photographed by accident. He's wearing a mask, and I'm wondering if he was amongst the young men in masks who attacked the police on Hrushevsky Street later that afternoon. I don't know. Was he a provocateur? Maybe, but at any rate, it all blew up. Basically what happened was on Hrushevsky Street is the street that goes from basically a square next to the Maidan up to the Parliament, and so that's and also the Cabinet Ministers Building. So it's a very important road, and there were police blocking this part of Hrushevsky Street, and I did see them once because next to these barricades, police barricades, was and is the Institute of History of Ukraine. And I dropped off a book there, and I saw the police barricade, and I thought, should I take photos? I thought, well, maybe they won't like that, so then I just walked away. But I was in Mariinsky Park with a friend, a sociologist, talking to riot policemen, and it was clear to us from these riot policemen that they thought they were getting a raw deal, that these protesters had attacked them, had injured badly one of their comrades, and had blinded him. Some guy smashed in his helmet, basically. His police helmet got smashed in and damaged both eyes, supposedly. And, you know, these were policemen who said, these guys yell that you serve a crook. Yanukovych was a crook, all right? He said, but I serve the Constitution. I don't serve a crook, I serve the Constitution. And these guys were complaining about their pay and everything. Well, we were talking about this right when further down Hrushevsky Street, on the opposite end of Hrushevsky Street, these young men from right sector, but not just them, got mad at the police because there's a leader from Euromaidan, the Euromaidan protest movement, who called on the people to march on Parliament peacefully and to demand that the dictatorship laws be rescinded. This is also very strange because it's a Sunday, nobody's in Parliament. Hello, you're protesting to nobody. And also, there are all these police blocking Hrushevsky Street. So how are they going to do this? And ultimately, people lost their patience, and accounts vary, but probably the protesters tried to push back this police bus that served as the barricade. They started to push it back. The police started to fire tear gas, but also stun grenades, and then probably through some Afghan army veterans, people learned how to make Molotov cocktails, and they threw Molotov cocktails at the police. And then that started this fire. Eventually rubber bullets were fired. Eventually water cannon was fired, rubber bullets, and then by the night of January 21st, 22nd, in the early hours of January 22nd, someone was using live bullets and shot and killed 3 demonstrators. One of those demonstrators killed was Mikhailo Zhenevsky, January the 26th. He was given a funeral on the Maidan. So basically a week after that Maidan, where they booed the leaders and demanded action, you had the first killed. He actually wasn't the first killed. The first killed was, I think, this guy named Serhiy Nihoyan. And he served on the Maidan self-defense. He wasn't on the part of the Maidan where I was for the night, but he was on the opposite corner. And at this funeral, people started to chant, "Revenge, revenge, revenge, pomsta, pomsta, pomsta." People really got angry about these first shootings. And Right Sector, which took credit for starting the violence on Hrushevsky Street, started to make demands to both the opposition and the regime to change things, to get rid of these dictatorship laws. And another problem, to end this violence against the protesters, and there was also a problem where protesters were disappearing and being tortured and in some cases murdered. Because of this violence ratcheting up, tension ratcheting up, protesters actually seized control of state administrative buildings in a number of regions of Ukraine, first in the west and then in the center. They eventually took over buildings for all of the central and western parts of Ukraine. These seizures of buildings happened relatively peacefully, but there was pushing and shoving. Police did fire tear gas and stun grenades, and there were some protesters who fired fire extinguishers at policemen, but they were relatively peaceful occupations, relatively. But still, there were elements of violence that did happen. Windows were broken, all right? And this really alarmed people in the south and the east of Ukraine, especially the politicians of southern and eastern Ukraine. And many of them started to do all sorts of countermeasures to avoid this from happening in their buildings, to their buildings. In the Dnipropetrovsk region, for instance, they sent in all these titushki to go beat up Euromaidan protesters who supposedly were going to occupy the administrative building there, but they really weren't. That wasn't even planned. In the Zaporizhia region, in the south, I interviewed activists who had thought about storming the building, but then realized that big trouble could happen, and then the police just went after the protesters who were near the administrative building and beat up and put in prison a lot of these people. In the east and in the south, Euromaidan activists were targeted. In Crimea, their names, their phone numbers, their photographs were posted on leaflets all over the city. They were put on ads for the tram lines. So these activists were known all over the place. They were being targeted. Lots of threats, lots of intimidation. 2 Euromaidan activists I interviewed in Donetsk had to leave Donetsk because it looked like their lives were in danger. And it's very fuzzy here. There were rumors of like people being tortured, murdered, and their bodies left on the railroad tracks. And my friend, the sociologist, said, "Don't tell anyone this," but it comes from a reliable source. But you sort of wonder, did it really happen that way? And as far as I know, it may not have happened on that big of a scale, but it was happening, and people were spreading this on the social networks. And so violence was really upsetting people, really upsetting people. There were unconfirmed stories about people filling up morgues that weren't true. And then there was this guy who I later interviewed. He was an activist from Euromaidan as well. Dmitro Bulatov, he disappeared for a number of days, and supposedly his torturers tried to crucify him on a wall, and they cut off part of his ear. This story, the problem is now there are some people from Euromaidan saying that this story may have been made up because some things don't add up. Basically, he wasn't in any real threat. Instead, he was deep in debt. But they didn't want to talk about this openly because they were afraid it would undermine the cause. And this brings me to what I think is my main argument I'm going to be trying to make here today and hopefully in my book. This is what was driving the revolution at this point. Anger at a regime that was torturing, kidnapping, and killing people, no matter if that was really 100% true or not. And no one was being mobilized to, look forward, or no one was being offered a positive message. People in the south and east of Ukraine who, in opinion polls, consistently said that they were not in favor of these Euromaidan protests, they were opposed to them, who consistently said, we don't want this association agreement with the European Union, people who consistently said, we support Yanukovych as president in the future elections of 2015, these people weren't changing their opinions at all. Even after some of this terrible violence in late January, the opinion polls for Yanukovych were still strong in the south and east of Ukraine, where his base of support had been all along. So what would really change from this? And there were people who said this violence is going nowhere. And there were activists saying they felt like they were marginalized because who was getting center stage? It was right sector, the people throwing the Molotov cocktails. But what was also feeding the anger was this sense that the political opposition was doing nothing. Every Sunday they would have an assembly where they talk about all these demands they'd make for the regime or else, and all these politicians would show up, and it was like the soap opera Santa Barbara. Every week it showed up, the same characters, similar drama, but it was starting to get boring. And this actually showed up on Facebook in early February when things had calmed down, and then they blew up on the 18th. The 18th of February, it was supposed to be a peaceful advance. That's what they call it, a peaceful advance. Mirny nastup, peaceful advance. It's very strange because it's like peaceful offensive. But people got prepared for this. They got their headgear, helmets, bulletproof vests. They were ready for something. And still, this student coordinating council called on everyone to show up. And their slogan was brother for brother, student for student. But it ended very badly. There were Titushki, this time armed with guns. They'd been supplied guns in early February. They were behind rank and file riot policemen who were new recruits. And basically, some films don't like to talk about this, but there were young toughs that at first they were just arguing with each other, all right? There was a pro-Yanukovych, anti-Maidan demonstration taking place in Mariinsky Park. And then you had the people from the Peaceful Advance in front of them, yelling at them, telling them, why are they, why are you policemen serving a murderer and all this other stuff? And there were some arguments going on. It was just arguing, but then at one point, these young toughs, as one participant said, decided to take down the barriers that the police stood behind and started to go after the police. And fights broke out. Now, some demonstrators recall that the Titushki were firing petards and explosives and maybe even some primitive bullets at them. Either way, it started all this violence, which also happened around the same time along Institutsky Street because there were police barricades protecting the government offices, including Parliament, including the government building, cabinet minister's building, and everything. And people were they started to push around vehicles that were part of the barricades. Then they set them on fire. Same time, policemen were up on roofs firing rubber bullets, firing stun grenades. People were getting killed. About 10 people were killed that day at least. Here's a father and son who were badly wounded. And then there began this attack on the Maidan. Basically, people were told to clear out of the Maidan by 6 p.m. or they would face the consequences. And Berkut and these forces, these Berkut and riot police, they converged on the Maidan, all right, and the demonstrators, they decided to set up a firewall, and they burned tires, they burnt clothes, they burnt tents, they burnt everything in sight to keep the police from advancing on them because they had no weapons. But it is clear that there were some people on the night of 18th that did have weapons. It was a very heroic night, but I should remind you that a lot of people left the Maidan when this happened. A lot of people in Kiev weren't affected by this at all. In fact, most of the city ran as it usually did. It was only on the 18th that people started to feel like they were being affected by this because the metro was shut down. The metro was shut down and people had no way to get home. And so people started to panic. All right? And people started to leave the Maidan. And it looked like, at least to one person I interviewed, that 3 times the number of people were leaving the Maidan as opposed to the others who were coming towards the Maidan. So 3 times more people were leaving this place than coming. So, I mean, people were very scared of what was happening. In the meantime, people on the internet exploded. There was this that showed up, this meme. But there were also Euromaidan protesters who were part of self-defense who also lost it. I spoke with a Canadian-Ukrainian, very nice man who runs a pizza parlor, very successful businessman in Kiev. And he said that at one point his battalion decided they were going to make fertilizer bombs. And they were going to go get the ingredients. While they're getting the ingredients, though, and making these bombs, they had to run to a central Ukrainian city in Vinnytsia to get medical supplies because people were getting killed on the Maidan. They also bought pistols. They bought guns. Well, yes, I knew this might run over. The trades union building burnt down. Lots of people got killed there. But in the provinces, people retaliated. In Lviv, people saw what was going on in Kiev. They were very much, they identified very closely with these protests, and they started to seize buildings. They seized the police headquarters. They seized the prosecutor general's office, or the, I guess you'd call it the prosecutor general's office. And then they went after the secret police, the SBU. And they set fire to these buildings, and allegedly they stole guns. They stole weapons. We don't know how true this is. One journalist I interviewed said that there couldn't be that many guns, that maybe like only a handful disappeared, but the police claimed that 1,189 pieces of weaponry had been missing. And there were people in the political opposition who were warning U.S. and other foreign ambassadors that if things kept going like they were, there would be street warfare in Kiev, and these weapons from Lviv would come and be used there. So we do see politicians manipulating the violence. Here we see the police headquarters taking over, this young man sitting in the press conference room. Then we get to the 20th, and this is when there's this major firefight, and after that, Yanukovych basically quit, and the next day he fled the country. What's important about this is that some people from Western Ukraine, possibly, had weapons at the conservatory building, which is right here, and they were firing on these policemen down here at one point. And supposedly, they killed maybe at least 3 policemen and wounded several others. The figures could be a little bit higher, but policemen were being killed. And this led to a moment of chaos where people rushed up and tried to go after. They tried to go after the presidential administration building, supposedly. It's not really clear what they were doing. They were running up Institutsky Street. Supposedly, it was to take over, where the police were leaving, because the police were retreating after they'd been shot up by these snipers. And the problem was that when these protesters ran up this street, they ran into a trap. There were snipers at the Hotel Ukraine and at the October Palace that killed many of them, dozens of them. And I know that I wasn't supposed to go over 50 minutes, but I will tell you, at this point, I pretty much lost my enthusiasm for the revolution, because one of those killed was one of our students at Lviv National University, where I taught for 2 years. This was his body. He was shot in the neck. A bullet ricocheted, and he bled to death in 4 minutes. This was him when he was our student. What else I could tell you in this next minute, because I did run over the time limit, and I do apologize, is that this really unleashed, I think, really something awful, because more violence came after the regime fell. In Kharkiv, there was Russian Spring, orchestrated in part by military intelligence from Russia and Russians that came in buses from across the border, but still involving a lot of people who were angry at what happened on the Maidan. And they beat up Maidan activists. In Donetsk, they seized buildings, even though there had been a pro-Ukrainian rally, and there had been pro-Ukrainian forces there. And I would say that, and Euromaidan activists from Crimea told me that when this violence got worse in Kiev, it polarized opinions in Crimea, where you were either pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian. So actually, it made the situation much worse. And thus I say that really what we're seeing as of 2016 is Pandora's box is open. There's been a lot of misery, death. Where the hope is, I'm not sure yet. Thank you very much for your attention.
Young men being drafted into the military?
Well, there is now a draft for young men, yes. They've gone back to the draft system, but there are many people who are evading the draft. For instance, a friend of mine went to work in Romania, in part so that he could support his family, but also so that he could avoid the draft. And yeah, I mean, this has been a big problem. Some people in the media have talked about it openly, but people don't like to talk about it. Official sources will tell you that the desertion rate is not that high. Others will tell you it's much higher. But it is a problem. But I mean, yes, young men are being drafted into the military.
From the West and from the East?
Yes, actually from all regions that are under Ukrainian control. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Risch. You're the first person I've been able to listen to in person to be able to deliver a blow-by-blow account, as riveting as Dr. Mark had said. The line from the Kremlin all through this was that the protesters were basically brown shirt Nazis that must be opposed. You referred to conservative, and you used the term Nazi. You're the first person on site I've heard that. Would you care, could you put a percentage on the population that you could identify as being brown shirt in their worldview?
Well, if you're looking at the Euromaidan self-defense, I think the number was 5,000. Was 5,000 at one point. Maybe it was more. But of that, I mean, you would have only 100 that was run by Right Sector, and Right Sector was sort of a mixed lot. And so, how many of them were real Nazis, or how many of them were just far-right types is hard to say. But it would seem that there were at least several hundred that were there. One detail I forgot to add, which sort of might, have been emphasized by Russian propaganda as well, the city council for Kiev, the Kiev City Hall, the city administration building. It was occupied by these protesters, including Svoboda, but also many right-wing organizations. And by the way, they kept a dungeon there, and they were keeping some people there for questioning. I heard this through the grapevine, and I've seen it on various blogs, this problem of what they were doing in the city hall building. So I would say several hundred. The thing is what they were doing. And maybe it's not their numbers really that counts. It's the fact that, they were there getting the crowd all worked up the 19th of January to, attack the police. And I wonder about the guy holding up that sign. He was wearing a mask, and it tended to be the radicals that wore masks on Maidan. Yeah, I would say a few hundred. I would still say a small minority, because when you look at the opinion polls that were conducted at the Maidan by sociologists, they mention by mid-January 2014, something like 92% of the participants had no political affiliation. So they're not affiliated with any of these right-wing parties, for sure. So you can't, if you look at party affiliation, right-wing parties had no role. But did right-wing ideas matter? Yes, they did. For some people, and those few people, no matter how few, and I'll just say a few hundred, I don't think it was that big, they played a very active role in shaping events. They're probably the hotheads who attacked the people on the police at Mariinsky Park. Also, the Party of Regions headquarters that day, February the 18th, was burned down by radical protesters. And I know this woman whose ex-husband is a right-wing guy, and he was there setting the building on fire, and he thought it was great. They were finally doing something. So, the far right was there.
I have a two-part question. The first part is, did the United States government play any role in those events?
Yeah.
And the second part question is, which is independent of this, what is your interpretation of the United States government did nothing against Crimean annexation?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, with Crimea. Well, regarding your first question, which is really interesting, they were definitely trying to shape events. I would say that probably, it seems to me that Russia and the U.S. were the most active in trying to influence events. The EU, I think, was very hesitant. And there was the infamous phone call between Ambassador Pyatt and the Undersecretary of State for Russia, Eurasia, Eastern Europe, I guess it is, Victoria Nuland. And they were talking about, making a deal, trying to make some sort of deal where the opposition could put this guy forward as prime minister, and that Yanukovych would maybe agree to this. So, I mean, they were lobbying for certain interests. I mean, the other thing, too, is Senator John McCain spoke at the Maidan along with this senator, I think he was from Connecticut, Murphy was his last name. I can't remember his first name. But both of them showed up. Actually, John McCain was on my plane the first time I went to the Maidan, and I thought, this is interesting. Yeah, he spoke there, and he tried to influence events. He claimed that, if you guys win, we'll be with you all the way. And the crowd thanked him in English. When I was in Kharkiv for a Euromaidan forum, I was listening to this speech given, and one of the activists said that for this forum, they had invited one of the workers from the U.S. From the U.S. Embassy. One one worker from the U.S. Embassy was there, along with some members from the European Parliament, a couple of them. And I thought at the time, well, what are they doing here? I mean, I am a historian, I'm not a political scientist, but it does seem like there was, I don't know if you call it soft power or lobbying. It was going on all the time, clearly. But Russia was also lobbying its interests too.
So you mentioned that the Orange Revolution, that you think like you said like the revolution could have been avoided. It could have been like there could have not been as much violence. Would you attribute that to like the grievances that were spread among like ideologies like the right center, or is it because of the weakness in the economic state to react to the situation following the Ridge election and their protests against them?
Yeah, very interesting question. I mean, I think one of the problems is that this Yanukovych regime probably, it was more willing to sort of take these risks that seemed a little strange. I mean, they were willing to use force when force wasn't necessary. They could have left the protesters, the protests die out November the 30th, December the 1st. There are reports nowadays that suggest there were people within Yanukovych's camp that wanted to discredit Yanukovych himself. There's this guy who is Serhiy Lyovochkin, who was his chief of staff and then was shortly was removed as chief of staff just before Berkut moved in on these people, November the 30th. So I think there were reckless people in the Yanukovych administration. I'm not really sure how much Yanukovych was really running things. I think he was more than willing to be vindictive. And you have to remember this too, is that the Orange Revolution it deprived him of the presidency. So, I mean, he had lots of ill will towards these people. So I think, perhaps that had made things so much worse. And the state did provoke violence by enacting the dictatorship laws, all right? And so they played that role. And I would have to say that, I mean, responsibility for this violence does rest with Yanukovych and his administration. They should not have been escalating their responses to the protests, which they did. Because they escalated their responses, and cracked down on these people periodically, it turned it into a situation where it was us versus them. And there was no middle ground. And so discussions on like membership to the European Union or signing the association agreement, that all seemed to become less important than overthrowing the regime. On the other hand, you have to admit there were a lot of political forces out there that wanted Yanukovych out of office. And there was, for example, well, he's not a politician, but there was one Ukrainian writer who even put out a video addressed to the students, acting as if it was just students running these protests, which they weren't, in which he told them that their next assignment should be to make sure that Yanukovych does not become president in the 2015 elections. So, I mean, there were a lot of people who were quite willing to see this regime toppled, too.
And that mostly be like activists and like political elites.
Well, this is the thing, that there were some amongst the political elite who would be happy to take leadership away from the party regions. And they did when Yanukovych fled.
Questions? Anyone?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry because you already spoke a little bit about that, and my question would be perhaps a little bit like the one concerning the U.S. position. But as a French student, I'm wondering since the beginning, what could be the position of? You said that the EU wasn't really comfortable with this issue, the Ukraine issue, but was there a common policy, like a Franco-German couple with the same policy that managed the union? toward this issue, or it was just too complex for the Union and European countries that were finally concerned?
Well, France and Germany were involved in these negotiations between the opposition and Yanukovych. Also, the Poles were involved. Poland was involved. I think that was partly because the foreign minister was at that point in charge of foreign affairs for the EU. I can't exactly remember. But I think one of the problems is that when dealing with this Ukraine crisis is that Russian interests did play a role. They knew that if Ukraine moved closer to the EU, there would be some sort of economic backlash from Russia because Ukraine had been in Russia's economic sphere of influence. And that was of great concern to Russian leaders. And actually, the summer before all this stuff happened, there had been a trade war between Russia and Ukraine. And so I think the problem with the EU was that they would have to deal with this problem of what kind of a state is going to move closer to us, and how will Russia respond. And so I think that made them very cautious. And thus, they were only voicing deep concern when things got bad. And that angered Ukrainians who believed that more should have been done. What more should have been done? I don't know. I mean, maybe in terms of, sanctions, further sanctions against the Yanukovych regime. So I mean, I think it's because of the complicated economic picture, really. These relations between Russia and Ukraine that they had to deal with. And maybe they didn't think them all the way through.
Other questions? Only once? Or twice? Anyway, so thank you once again to Bill Risch.
Thank you.